So we're going to continue with chapter 7 by talking about lifestyle and values. So first, what is lifestyle? Lifestyle is essentially how consumers spend their time and their money, right? So the idea behind this is if you're trying to understand somebody, right, one thing that you can do is instead of talking to them about what they think, is you can observe what they do, right? Because like everybody knows, actions speak louder than words, right? So if that's the case, maybe it could be useful to actually see what people do with their two most valuable resources, which are time and money. In fact, you can pull it all down to time, right? Because the way you usually get money is by spending time maybe working or doing something that enables you to get the money, right? So it really boils down to time. So what you're spending your time in, which is a finite resource, is what should indicate what kind of things are you interested in, value, and you prefer, right? So this is another way of getting to consumer identity, maybe instead of looking at it from a psychological perspective, but looking at it from a very behavioral perspective. So a lifestyle is a collection of choices, essentially, products and services. Good. Now, what kind of lifestyles can you identify? Well, there are different types, right? Some of which are commonly used in everyday language and life, right? So here you have a few, like, for example, I don't know, metrosexual, right? Which is a person that takes extreme care of their appearance, right? And it's usually referred to as males, although it doesn't have to be, I guess. And it will have a series of behaviors and products associated with it. So this will be a person that maybe has a lot of different product options in their wardrobe because they really care about appearance. They may make specific purchases that enable them to groom themselves beyond what's, let's just say, average for the culture, right? So maybe they are, they'll get manicures and pedicures, and they might use makeup, right? Etc., etc. So there is a whole host of products and services associated with this kind of lifestyle and image that some people portray because they are trying to A, be part of a certain group, and B, attract other people into their lives that are interested in this kind of image and behaviors, right? So the idea of lifestyle marketing is that if you're looking for a way of segmenting the market, using behaviors that are displayed as a pattern, like the ones that I just described, are more powerful than looking at something that may be easier to collect, but ultimately far away from preferences and values of people, which will be something like demographics. So a lot of companies, when they actually try to do a segmentation study, and they try to put people into groups so they can just target them separately, and they tend to use demographics. And the reason why is because it's cheap and easily accessible. But unfortunately, demographics tend to be poor predictors of behavior. On the other hand, if you focus on behavior to begin with, right, and lifestyle being a constellation essentially of purchases and uses of products and services, hey, you're already starting from behavior, so it's very predictive of what's going to happen in the future, right? The kind of products and brands that they're going to be purchased. So if we go with the premise that a lifestyle is something that happens, right? We can observe certain patterns that repeat or different customers in terms of the products that they use. We should be able to leverage these patterns of consumption in our branding and product creation strategies, right? So for example, if you have somebody who is on the adventurer side in terms of their lifestyle, maybe they like to do extreme sports, they watch string sports, maybe also they like to be outdoors, whatever it is, right? There is a series of patterns that we actually find, and because of that they use certain products together. Well, I might be able to leverage that when it comes down to branding, right? So for example, here you have an example of a co-branding strategy where you have two brands that are distinct companies, but they get together when it comes down to branding a particular product because they see a pattern where people that tend to maybe go on adventure drives, I don't know, in a motorcycle, they might actually use a GoPro and they tend to drink Red Bull, right? So putting these two products together from a branding perspective, given the fact that certain lifestyles have high incidence of purchase in both of the products, makes a lot of sense, right? And you have here other examples, right? Not a surprise, like, Nike and Apple with their running app, right? Where you are merging the sports nature and just do it of Nike with the technological proneness of Apple, right? So these co-branding opportunities arise because the personalities of the two brands are compatible, and because we see patterns in the marketplace that makes us believe that putting these two brands together, what you're going to get is something that is actually more valuable than the two brands independently, right? And the idea behind this in branding is described as the complementarity between either the brands or the products. By the way, you need to consider both, right? So both the brand personalities need to be compatible, and hopefully the products are complementary, meaning that when you put them together, you get more value out of this. By the way, this concept comes from economics. And if you study Econ 101, hopefully you've talked about substitutes and complementary products. And the classic example of complementary products will be something like peanut butter and jelly, right? When you put the two things together, obviously what happens is that, the sandwich, of course you need some bread too, the sandwich seems to taste better than if you put them separate, right? So this, putting two products together, giving you additional value is the idea of complementarity. This can also happen with brands, okay? And if you take this to extreme, instead of looking at two individual parts, you have what we call a consumption constellation, which is the kind of brands that a particular customer engages with. And through this constellation of brands is how we can identify patterns of behavior that will enable us to find out your lifestyle. All right, lifestyle at the end of the day is how you spend your time and your money. So the constellation of brands, or the groups of brands, or the network of brands that you usually interact with, and by interact I mean buy and use, right, is the one that is gonna indirectly tell the marketer what your lifestyle is, right? So think about it. Lifestyle is a very empirical concept. It's something that, nobody has a little sticker in their forehead that tells you what their lifestyle is. But if you actually look at their patterns of consumption, something that we can do now maybe even better than you used to with all the social networks, right? You see what everybody's doing or what they are buying through the emails, etc. So you can put together lifestyles a lot easier than you could actually before. Which was the traditional market research study where they ask you a lot of questions. Now a lot of this stuff is done indirectly. Here you have the same concept of what lifestyles really entail. You have lifestyle here in the middle as the intersection of essentially three things, right? One is the personality, who the person is, right? What their interests are. And two is the kind of products that they actually purchase and use. And finally, what kind of experiences and context they are usually under, right? So when you put all three things together, what you have is essentially what we described as the lifestyle, which is where you spend your time and your money, right? And the reason why it's particularly powerful from a marketing perspective is because you're directly talking about behavior, as opposed to asking people in general about maybe something like demographics, like we were talking about before, which may or may not correlate to ultimately behavior, like purchase brands or use brands. Now, what is psychographics? Psychographics is basically the systematic study of psychological concepts and how they apply to marketing decision making, right? So how do consumers actually go about making decisions? And for that, you can leverage multiple concepts that we have discussed, things like personality, but also lifestyle and motivations, etc. So the idea behind this is, if you just stuck with demographics, the results for your segmentation and targeting that is going to come afterwards tend to be very weak. If you can enhance that or substitute that with something that relates to the personality of the consumer, to their motives, to their values, it goes much more to the core of who they are and what they are interested in. And because of that, you tend to do a much better job at identifying segments that are actually relevant. That means that they are indeed different and they're going to behave differently in the marketplace. And number two, it enables you to actually target them with unique strategies that is going to give you better results in the marketplace. If you really understand what the preferences of people are and what their personalities and motives are, it's going to really enable you to create products that are more meaningful for those segments, but also communicate in ways that resonate better with that group of customers, right, or potential consumers. So psychographic analysis is basically a set of techniques that are used to leverage all these concepts that we've been describing from psychology, sociology, and anthropology that try to get at the why people buy what they want, right, as opposed to, maybe just looking at who's buying it, which is the traditional demographic approach, right? So psychographics is just a different way of segmenting the marketplace. And you can do that both at the overall profile, right, level, where you just try to cluster or group customers based on their lifestyle altogether, or you can go down to the product specific level and do similar analysis where you try to identify what the different customers are interested in. So there are companies that will do studies that are just a general lifestyle segmentation study. We'll talk about one of those in a minute, the balls, for example. And there are others that just focus on product-specific segmentation studies. And all of them entail a whole host of psychometric techniques where you try to measure this either lifestyle or personality or motivational aspects. And based on those, and maybe using some statistical technique like cluster analysis, you just create groups of people that are hopefully more relevant when it comes down to the decision making and the products and brands that they engage with than just demographics. Okay. So here you have, for example, a table that lists activities, interests, and opinions, right? And this is a whole host of very useful information if you're trying to get at the reasons why people buy what they buy and use what they use from a product and service standpoint. Now notice, you have here demographics. These are usually also collected whenever you're collecting information about psychographics, by the way. But the reason why age, for example, is a poor predictor of any study that you conduct or anything that is going to look at preferences from people, which is essentially what you're trying to get at, is because two people of the same age are going to have very different interests, right? Whereas here, when you're trying to measure activities, interests, and opinions, right, how much they value family versus the job versus the community versus, I don't know, any of the other aspects like food, right? I'm more of a foodie, for example, myself. And because of that, what do? I talk about food all the time. You probably have noticed that. But I also learn how to cook, right? Because I care about it, and maybe I don't have enough money to just eat at expensive restaurants all the time. Maybe every once in a while for a special occasion, right? But food is one of my interests, and that it's reflected in both the products that I buy and the behaviors in which I engage. If you look at people my age, that's not always necessarily the case, right? So demographics can help you understand who is buying something, but is the activities that they engage in, the interests, and their opinions what's really going to dictate and tell you why they do what they do, and maybe enable you to do a better job at marketing to them. The next table is essentially the same thing, just a longer list of more activities. So what can these psychographic studies be used for? Well, many different uses, right? Like any other insight or information that you're going to gain, you can use it for different things. One is you can use it for target marketing, right? Obviously, if you can identify segments using psychographic studies that are more meaningful in the sense that they relate more closely to behaviors and purchasing interest, and then you're going to be able to decide who you're going to target more meaningfully than if you're just looking at demographics, which might actually be more distal or farther away from the preferences that consumers actually have, right? And also, they might give you a new perspective on the market, right? So for example, through some psychographic analysis, by maybe doing in-depth interviews with potential customers, you might find, like Home Depot did years ago, that people were interested in basically doing their own home improvement, right? So maybe traditional hardware stores were not the most amenable structure because they were geared towards professionals for the most part, right? So the Home Depot came up with a new angle on how to sell products and now services for home improvement by understanding that do-it-yourselfers go about it in a different way, right? And also, it can give you insight into how to position your brands, right? So if you understand what people are interested in, that's going to give you an idea about what kind of dimensions are actually relevant to consumers when it comes down to positioning. Remember, positioning is how people perceive your brand or product, but more generically brand in their minds, right? So if you're trying to position yourself as a product that is luxurious, for example, if you understand from these psychographic studies that maybe luxury is not something that it's valued by your customer base, maybe it's time to shift your positioning in the marketplace, right? Also, it can help you in the communication efforts, right? Because it's going to give you insight into what resonates with your customers and what doesn't, etc., etc. Good. Here you have one example of a general lifestyle segmentation approach. It's called the VALS. This is the VALS 2, but there is a 1 also, right? And this is somewhat popular, right? It's used across the globe and in different product categories, right? And what it does is it clusters or it groups people into, you can see there are 8 categories, right? Based on mostly 2 dimensions, okay, which are resources and self-consciousness, right, or self-expression. So by doing that, you can see here how you have different sets of customers that are going to be maybe behaving differently, solving problems differently, and because of that, acquiring different products and services. Okay. Now, finally, we've talked about lifestyles, we've talked about personality. Now let's get into values. Now, what is a value? A value is essentially our balanced judgment about an attribute or object, right? So a value is something that we either think it's good or we think it's bad. That's what I mean by balance, right? It has either a negative or positive connotation. And these values are probably the underlying reason why we have and display different motivations in the marketplace. So if we can get to understand consumer values, this might actually uncover a lot of the other pieces of the puzzle that we've been studying beforehand, right? Because a lot of the things that we do, we do them because we are motivated by certain whys, and those whys might actually be preceded by the values that we have as a person, right? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now. So first, I've already told you what a value is. A value system is a collection of values that is adopted by an individual. Okay, these value systems are usually inculcated while you are young. So usually they are developed and adopted in your former years when you're young, in a family setting. Usually this is why the family plays such a crucial role in developing the personality of a consumer, right? And our interests and behaviors, etc., right? So you have the value system. And then, of course, those value systems are going to evolve over time, and they do change somewhat also across cultures, right? So culture, which is society at large, is going to determine to some degree what's valuable and what's not. And the process of becoming part of a culture, it's going to be called enculturation, right? That's the one that you were born in. There is another process that might happen that sounds similar, which is acculturation. That's what happens when you move into a new culture, maybe a new country, maybe within the same country, a different subculture, where things are done differently, right? Where things are valued differently. And that can actually be challenging, right? For example, I remember when I came to the United States, one of the cultural small but important parts that I just didn't realize is the distance, right? So in Spain, for whatever reason, when we're talking to each other, even if we are not mad or upset or anything, we tend to get really close to each other. So you will see that, people, even strangers, people don't know each other. They have a physical distance that they are comfortable with talking, that it's a lot closer than here in the United States, where you're usually more like at least an arm's length away, right? So guess what happened when I came to this country? I wasn't aware of this, right? So I went through an acculturation process, right? Where I basically, every time that I will talk to a student, I will dance with them because I will try to get closer. And by the way, this is subconscious. I'm not doing this thinking about it. It's just the distance that I'm comfortable to, because that's what I was raised and used to before when I was in Spain, right? It was close. So what I will do is I will approach them, even not noticing, right? I just feel uncomfortable if I'm far away. It's like they are not listening or they are not going to get what I'm saying. And of course, guess what happens to them? They feel threatened because that's not the distance that you're usually comfortable at in this country, unless maybe you're in a relationship or whatever, right? So because of that, I will literally dance. I will step one step forward, and the student will do one step back, and we'll just go through the room. And it took me a little while to realize that there was something happening, right? And there are different norms, which are essentially rules that govern our behavior, right? That are very important. And most of these are, we take as given. We don't even think much about it, right? So when you get, for example, into a restaurant, there are certain things that you expect, right? And those rules that basically control basic behaviors are known as customs, right? So this is something that, when you get into a restaurant in the US, you expect to be greeted by a host or hostess, right? And that's just what you expect, because this is what usually happens, right? Amor, it's a custom that has strong moral implications. For example, if you want to go wild and extreme, cannibalism, it's definitely frowned upon in most cultures. Not all, though. There were some cultures that were cannibal, right? And there are some tribes that traditionally were cannibals. But it's something that is really, I don't think I have to explain more than that. That will be amor, right? And a convention is just the kind of norms that usually regulate our everyday life, right? Things that we just, take for granted, things that, we know we need to do. Like, for example, every time you get out of the house, you put clothes on, right? And that's a convention. This is like, everybody will be shocked if you will show up naked anywhere. In fact, you will probably end up in jail, right? So as you can see, we have all these expected behaviors that we engage in all the time because we live in a society, and those are basically governing our behaviors and the products that we both buy and use on a regular basis. Now, I was talking about values and systems of values. Not all values are created equal, right? So we're going to make a distinction between terminal values and instrumental values. Now, what is the difference? Terminal values, this is what we're trying to achieve overall, right? This is something that is of particular importance in our life, right? Like, for example, you have here, like, having an exciting life. I don't know if this is one of your terminal values. Maybe I'm a little bit more of a I don't know, even kill person. I don't know. That's maybe a good. So maybe like a comfortable life will be something that I will value, right? And if that's the case, what we're gonna see is that there are additional values that are gonna precede this value that we're trying to achieve, right? And these we're gonna call instrumental values. These are pieces of the puzzle that, if put together, will enable us to achieve these terminal values that maybe is what we're ultimately trying to do, right? So being ambitious, maybe it's not in my nature, maybe it's not what I want per se, but I know that if I want to have a comfortable life, I'm going to have to do well in my career. So I need to display at least some level of ambition that is going to enable me to do reasonably well. And because of that, it's going to enable me to achieve this comfortable life, right? So this idea of instrumental versus terminal values, it's important, right? Because at the end of the day, we're going to have a collection of values that we're trying to achieve, some of which might actually conflict, right? And we're going to have to decide what we want to put at the top of the pyramid, what are the things that we really want to go after, and what are the pieces of the puzzle that are going to enable us to achieve it. Next slide, more of the same. You can look through them. I think it's pretty reasonable and simple to just read and understand. Okay. Here you have some more, right? Wisdom, right? Maybe you want to achieve wisdom. You want to be a sage, right? So in that situation, for wisdom, maybe you need self-control, right? Because remember, wisdom is not knowledge. Wisdom is basically what? Be able to make good decisions. So maybe not being driven by, instant pleasure-seeking behavior. So you need to show some discipline and self-control to do that. Anyway, I think most of this makes sense. At least they do in my mind. So you can go through them and think about it. The important concept is the difference between terminal and instrumental values, right? Terminal is what you're trying to achieve. Instrumental values is what enables you to get there. They are both values, but one is kind of like an intermediate step. Okay, here we have 3 other psychographic studies that link values to something that is useful for a marketing perspective, right? The list of values is a generic, or I shouldn't say generic because it's not, a general segmentation framework that is used to link values to maybe consumption behaviors, right? So basically it's going to identify a set of consumer groups that are going to have similar share values within them. Okay, so this is essentially a segmentation or a grouping study. The means and chain model is trying to do something a little bit different. It's trying to link product attributes, so things that products have, to terminal values that people are trying to achieve. Remember, we were talking about instrumental versus terminal values, right? So to achieve those terminal values, the things that you really care about, right, that you're really trying to get, you might need some intermediary values that are going to enable you to get there. And if you want to, unwind the thread even further, for you to get either the terminal values or the intermediary values, you might need certain product attributes that are going to enable you to achieve that, right? So if I'm trying to have a comfortable life, maybe I have to be ambitious, and in the process of getting there, maybe I need to, get a world-class education that is going to enable me to both, work on my ambition aspect and achieve my comfortable life, right? So certain product attributes, in this case, service attribute, that will enable me to achieve those terminal values. Now, the way this study, the means in chain model, gets to this is using a psychological technique called laddering, which is essentially a set of interrelated questions that try to unravel what are the underlying reasons for people to do something, in this case, to buy a certain product or brand. Okay, good. And then finally, we have the values, which we already talked a little bit about, so I'm not going to talk some more, but it's a study that also looks at values and customers and uses it for a segmentation purpose. Good. So what have we covered in this chapter then? We first talked about personality. We talked about some of the classic and most influential psychologists and how their theories have shaped the way we understand personality. Personality being these pretty stable traits that people display when it comes down to their way of being, right? Those personalities are hopefully going to reflect or they are going to be related to the kind of behaviors that we actually observe in people and how they react to products and also marketing communications, right, or stimuli in general. Okay. We've also said that not only people have personalities, but brands do as well, right? And because brands have personalities, developing those personalities is actually worthwhile but very expensive and time-consuming endeavor, right? We talked about some of the different aspects that underline those brand personalities. We've also talked about how people buy products and services to express their personalities, right? And the collection of all those products and services that they engage with is essentially going to tell us about their lifestyle, right? What is their lifestyle is this collection of behaviors, right? And that those collection of behaviors are usually more useful when it comes down to segmenting markets than demographics. And the reason why is because it's closer to actual behavior and preferences, which is what we're trying to really get at. Psychographics are, a set of techniques that enable us to get to a combination of these personalities, lifestyles, and values, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And we can use those techniques to maybe unearth interesting segments or other insights that could enable us maybe to launch new brands or new products or communicate differently with our customers. And finally, we did talk about how values can be at the root or value of the behaviors that we actually observe in people, that those values are usually instilled early on in your life, maybe within the familial group, and that the motivations that you display later in life are probably connected to those values that you have. And that's it for this chapter.